that. So,
Right.
so I can't comment like expertly on that, but
Okay.
I'm aware of that as there were these fashions. But as a historian, my concern is that in the 19th century, all history, not just Egyptology, all histories had very low standards. They hadn't really professionalized the standards in the field yet, and their peer review was not up to par. So like almost anybody could publish and look impressive, right? No matter how absurd their stuff. Now it got better in the early 20th century, but when I went to graduate school, Columbia University in New York, and my first day when I sat down to have a conference with my dissertation advisor, who was William V. Harris, who's an expert on ancient literacy and ancient economics and ancient imperialism and so on. He's a Roman history expert. One of the first things he told me is he said, I think he said this right out the bat, like, don't trust anything written before 1950. And I said, what do you mean? And like he like gave this explanation, and his thing is like, sometime around 1950, the standards of history had like a quantum improvement, where like before 1950, standards were pretty low, and areas of interest were pretty narrow. After the 50s, there was a much broader range of interests, and the standards started getting more sophisticated. Like it was harder to get through peer review. There were more rigorous standards for citation and argumentation and so on. Now there's a whole backstory to why that is. It's a long story that probably has to do with the GI Bill and the democratization of knowledge. But the phenomenon is documentable. You can show like a history book in 1925 and a history book in 1965 are really different in their standards of evidence, their standards of argument and citation and so on. So I'm distrustful even of things before 1950, but the 19th century is just the worst of it. Because there was a huge explosion of publication with no controls. And so that's why you get a lot of these crazy ideas just readily floating around.
Oh yeah, a lot of crazy ideas post 50s. After World War II, UNESCO they publish a statement on race, and so you had a lot of racism in the information.
Yeah. That's also an issue. Yeah. In some respects, it hasn't totally gone away, right? But
no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. We have to. Yeah, you got to keep your eye on that. Yeah, and so as we try to fight through that situation, it's like a carryover, and we're not trusting. So what is meant when you say, because I don't want to look at you and say, look at the color of your skin, I don't trust you. I had to learn how to block that out, because you can get tricked with somebody look just like you. I learned that very fast.
Oh, yeah.
Being in a cult. So I ain't worrying about what you look like. I want to know what you put on that paper, right? Can I look at the sources? Can I critique them? Can I see where you're coming from? Is your material valid? So and looking at it that way, right? What is meant when you say your work, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, right? Has went through peer reviewed. Has all your work went through peer reviewed? And what does that mean for you?
No, so my blog isn't peer reviewed. That's just me blogging, right? So you're really just trusting my standards there.
Okay.
And so yeah, certain publications I've done are peer reviewed and some aren't. And it varies, but depending on which thing you're talking about. So peer review generally means now there's publishers of books, publishers of journals, and there are bogus ones. There's ones that pretend to be peer reviewed but aren't really.
Open access.
Yeah, well, no, open access in and of itself is not a problem.
Correct, but some predatory. I'm talking about predatory.
Exactly. Yeah, they've shown this. There's like studies have been done where even there's bogus physics journals out there. So you really got to be on your guard for what journals and publishers have respect and respectability. But when they're doing it for real, what they mean is you submit an article or a book, and the usual standard is double-blind, duplicated peer review. So they'll have two separate independent peer reviewers. They will be experts in their field. So they'll be usually professors or retired professors with PhDs in the relevant field. And you won't know who they are, and ideally they won't know who you are. That's part of the process. Usually, not always the case, but usually that's the process. That's kind of the gold standard of peer review. And then those scholars will look at it and they'll say that their job is not to agree with the thesis. They don't have to agree with you. All they have to do is say, like, have they met the standards of the field? Are there any egregious mistakes here that should not fly? And really that's it, right? So like, are they meeting the standards in terms of citation, in terms of argumentation? Are there are tons of claims with no sources cited, or or are there claims made that are obviously false and that it should never pass, right? So that doesn't mean that like false things don't get through peer review. There's lots of garbage gets through peer review from time to time, but it is one standard that really does filter out quite a lot of material. So it does matter that if you can pass peer review. It's not a proof. It's not a gold seal that you're right or that you didn't lie or anything like that. But it is basically, it puts the bar much higher to get across. And I always think that in terms of like when people, and they used to do this is years and years ago. I wrote an article on pyramid stuff, like pyramid mania. Okay. Fox News did this thing. It was a whole story. So I wrote an article for Skeptical Inquirer many years ago about this. Ever since I wrote that article, for years, no more, I don't get this anymore, but for years I used to get all of these crazy treatises. People would send me their latest manuscript on some weird, crazy theory about the pyramids. My response is always like, get it through peer review. If you can't meet that bar, then you really should give up and change subjects, go study something else, right? Because that matters, because if someone could meet that bar, that tells me that they've met a standard that warrants my paying attention. Otherwise, it's just any crank stuff that people throw at me. I don't have enough life in me, not enough lifetime in me to read all the crank literature that could be thrown at me. But so having peer review actually does filter out a lot of stuff. It really narrows the field to things that's kind of the best of, right? And so that it actually shows that, okay, someone's looked at this and they vetted it and they say it's at least worth your paying attention to. It's at least you're worth your reading. That's kind of the gist of what peer review is going for in that. And yeah, to maintain the standards of professionalization and citation and all of that.
I can't remember this blog. It was this guy who he ran his website, and you could put it in there to see if the journal was predatory or not. I forget the name of it. They kind of sued him. What's his name?
There have been a few of those. I don't know what the latest one is, but yeah, you can Google how do you tell if a journal is peer reviewed,
right?
And you'll find a bunch of articles, and the best articles will probably link you to some of those sites that check that or score them and grade them.
Correct.
There's a variety of different ways to do that. There isn't really a single independent, there's not like a certifying agency that you can go to. Like with colleges, they're either certified or they're not, and there's like an actual official certifying agency that you can trust the standards of. We don't have that for peer review. But there are people who are trying to fill that gap with their own metrics, as it were. So particularly now, because the proliferation of disinformation sources has become a problem in like the last 5 years, right? Like 5 or 10 years.
Oh, that's the last 5 or 10. I thought it was more than that.
Well, it's always been a problem, but it's become like a crazy explosion of a problem, right? And you'd mentioned like the open access, right? The term open access, I don't want to demonize that. I don't want people to feel bad about it. Like there's a lot of really high quality, legitimate journals that do open access. But once it existed, now just anybody who wants to exploit anything could try and like fake their way in, and no one was policing it for a while, right? So like a lot of fake journals got created, and so you got to be wary about that.
Yeah, it's crazy. And my thing is, I always want to arm the community with the best information and keep them out of a cult. So a lot of that, if your believing brain, okay, and you're gonna get tricked. And so for me, scientific literacy is actually the vaccine, right, against the charlatans to come amongst you. So okay, we talked about quackery and stuff like that. So let me ask you this: doing a little reading up on you, and they say you're on the fringes, right, of Scott. Why do they say that? I know it's particularly for the Jesus Christ argument.
It's just the historicity stuff. Yeah.
Correct. Right.
Yeah. I don't think any of my history work is fringe other than that.
Right. You're right.
It's fringe in the sense that there's only a very, very small minority of us who are actually convinced by this yet. The reality is that most scholars are ignoring it. This is, and I talk about this. I have an article on how do you evaluate consensus. So consensus is often bogus, but also it's a valuable resource, right? So how do you tell the difference between a sound consensus and a malformed consensus, a consensus you can trust versus a consensus you can't? And I talk about how you can tell these things. But on your blog,
because we're gonna need that.
Yeah,
That's
I'll
gonna be a
throw it
good
in the
read for
private
everybody.
chat, and you can
Put it in the
carry it
private
over.
chat. I want the community to get that because we had
Yeah,
this.
let me see. Consensus. Yeah.
That's
All
good.
the stuff, just for people who know, you can find everything about me, my blog, my books, the online courses I teach,
We're gonna put that
all
out
the
there
stuff
for
you're
you.
interested in. You can find it at richardcarrier.info. In fact, this link, once it gets carried over, is my website. It's just a specific article. But from that site, you can find all the other things. You can find my Facebook feed, my Twitter feed, my everything else. So all the subjects that I write under, all my books, everything you want to know about me is there. It's warehoused at that site. But yeah, the one I just threw in private chat is the consensus. So it's on evaluating arguments from consensus. And one of the key factors, there's several, but one of the key factors is the consensus based on people who actually read the study that the consensus is on? Right? Is it a consensus of people who haven't even read it? Well, that's useless. It doesn't matter how expert they are. It's useless if they haven't even checked the subject, right? So you do need to figure out like who's actually checked and what is their consensus, right? You have to go look for the micro consensus, essentially. Otherwise, what you get is a sort of dogma, the sort of dogmatism that develops. And this happens even in the sciences, although the sciences are more resistant to dogmatism.
Correct.
The hard sciences are more resistant to dogmatism than the humanities. So philosophy and history are highly vulnerable to dogmatism. But yeah, so that's it's one of the things we look for is like when you're talking about the consensus, who are you talking about? One is, are they still alive? I often find people will say, well, the consensus, and they'll list a bunch of dead people. And I'm like, well, their opinions don't count anymore, right? Like they're not aware of what's going on now. That opinion's obsolete. We got to get back to what's the current thing. But yeah, you need more current, and you need people who've actually read the study that you're asking the consensus about. And if you can't have that, and sometimes you don't, like if the field is avoiding something, which I think they're doing with my work, they're actively avoiding interacting with it. So you can't, it's hard to find anyone who's actually read it. And it's not just me, I should point out, Raphael Lataster published Questioning the Historicity of Jesus. So there are 2 peer-reviewed publications, and they're by respectable peer-reviewed academic presses, 2 studies doubting the historicity of Jesus, and there's 0 studies refuting us, right? So that's the status of the field right now. So there is a dogmatism, a sort of resistance to reading this stuff. But if you can't do that, then what you have to do is you have to actually use your critical thinking and look at that. And I look at compare the arguments of. I'm going to put another one up. So I have this article on Galatians. Let me see if I can. Yeah, here it is. It's called, I'll put it in the private chat and you can throw it back over.
Okay.
It's called Galatians 1:19, Ancient Grammar and How to Evaluate Expert Testimony. Now, the occasion of the article is an obscure biblical translation question. But I use it as a teaching tool to teach general principles about what do you do when you have experts who are arguing, and they're arguing about ancient Greek, and you have no way of learning ancient Greek. So how do you vet that argument, right? Like, what do you do? Like, you have 2 competing experts saying different things. How do you figure out who's telling you the truth? Well, there is generally a way. There's usually a way to do it. And you just need to understand basic logic, basic fallacies, and how to analyze an argument. And if you can do that, you can compare their arguments, and you know which things to trust them. So one of the examples is, do they both agree on something? So like if one scholar lists a bunch of premises and the other scholar doesn't challenge those premises, then the critic is agreeing. So you have both the critic and the proposer both agree that those premises are true. Well, that's useful information. So like if their premise is about what the Greek means, well, then you don't need to know Greek, because they even the experts who are arguing with each other agree on that, right? And so you can use that data as a platform to build on. And you say, well, what do they disagree on and why? And then you analyze that and then try to figure out, like, are they giving valid arguments? Are they like logical arguments? Are they fallacious arguments, etc.? So you can evaluate expert disputes as a layperson, but it does require there to be an expert dispute, and it has to be. It's beneficial if it's properly argued. So that's why peer review matters. So like the examples I give in that article I just threw up are in peer-reviewed journals, so they require them to have full argumentation, full citation, and so on. So it ensures tight quality argumentation to a certain level. And that allows you, the layperson, to evaluate, to look at their both two arguments and compare their arguments. And then when it comes to premises that you can't evaluate, there's ways for you to rely on them to evaluate it for you, even when there's a dispute. So those are 2 examples of articles. Those articles say a lot more than what I just said, but they're designed to help lay people figure out what do you do with expert testimony when you yourself aren't an expert. And you really have to, because we really do need to be able to critique expert testimony. We can't just blindly rely on it.
You just running around blindly looking.